Okay. I hereby open the work session of the Springfield Planning Commission. Can I have a roll call, please?
Chair Rhodes Dye,
Here.
Vice Chair Buck,
Present.
Commissioner Salazar,
Present.
Commissioner Thompson,
Present.
Commissioner Schmunk, Commissioner Stout, and Commissioner Weber have all called in that they'll be absent today.
Okay. So, do we have any adjustments to the agenda? I didn't think so. Hearing none, I would like to ask members of the audience who are joining us by phone or online to please keep yourselves on mute until you are called to provide public testimony. This is a meeting where the public may attend but not provide comment. There will be opportunities to address the Planning Commission later tonight in our regular meeting, which follows the work session around 7 p.m. We have an agenda item for our work session, the climate friendly areas update. Is Chelsea here?
Yes, good evening, commissioners. I'm Chelsea Hartman. I'm a senior planner with City of Springfield. Also with me tonight from the Climate Friendly Area Project team is Monica Sather with city staff working on community engagement support for the project. And then we also have Alex Steinberger with Cascadia Partners, who's the consultant helping us with a lot of this work. So I'll get started with sharing the presentation and I'll pass it over to Alex partway through. And hopefully we're hoping to get through all the slides, and so try to hold questions for the end, and then we can always go back to slides if there are specific questions on them. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? Awesome. Oops. All right, so tonight we're going to start with an overview of what climate-friendly areas are. We'll refer to them as CFAs for short throughout the presentation, and then we'll get into some specific project updates about the community engagement, demographics and potential displacement risk, housing capacity, some infrastructure information, as well as various conditions about the market. And we'll wrap up with a summary of some potential CFA options. And just as a reminder, tonight we're seeking your guidance on some potential CFA scenarios so that we can inform our next steps for outreach and identifying draft plan and code concepts and the displacement mitigation strategies. We'll also be going to council on Monday, June 24th to share the same information and to also seek their guidance. So for climate-friendly areas, Oregon's climate-friendly and equitable communities rules were passed in 2022 in response to Governor Brown's executive order. The rules require some cities, like Springfield, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by identifying and adopting one or more CFAs. These will allow for dense urban mixed-use centers where people have options to meet most of their needs without relying on a car. Some of the specific requirements include at least one primary CFA that needs to be at least 25 acres in size. The areas must accommodate at least 30% of our 20-year housing need, which is a little less than 10,000 housing units. The areas must allow for a mix of uses, pretty similar to our existing mixed-use zones and nodal development areas. And the areas must be accessible via existing or planned high-quality bike and pedestrian networks and within a half mile of existing or planned high-frequent transit corridors similar to the MX corridor. Lastly, it must include strategies to help people avoid having to move elsewhere due to rising redevelopment costs. The state rules require at least one primary CFA that needs to be at least 25 acres large. The cities do have flexibility in designating additional primary or secondary CFAs to best meet our housing capacity requirements. The primary CFAs have higher allowed heights of at least 85 feet, which is similar to our existing mixed-use commercial zone, as well as districts with no maximum height limits, such as our R3 and community commercial areas and Glenwood mixed-use districts. The primary CFAs also have a required minimum density of 25 units per acre, which is similar to our existing R3 and Glenwood mixed-use districts. Secondary CFAs are similar, but have lower allowed heights of at least 60 feet and a lower density of 15 units per acre. The first round of outreach we just completed this spring involved sharing what the project is, why we're doing this work, and where the community can provide input to inform the potential CFA locations. Early efforts included a community survey to gauge thoughts on CFAs overall and the 4 potential areas we're considering. We received some direct follow-up from community members with questions or feedback. We had a project webpage, which includes a story map and a brief presentation and an interactive map that's searchable by address to see if you live in or near one of the areas. We sent over 3,000 letters to all owners, residents, and businesses within and near the areas. And we held interviews with the Glenwood development team that's working on a proposed master plan concept and Peace Health, since they are major landowners in some of the potential areas. Other engagement efforts included social media, flyers at various locations, and drop-in sessions for community members to learn more or ask questions. Of the survey respondents, 38% of folks were generally supportive and liked concepts about convenient neighborhoods with different amenities, better transportation options, and prioritizing investments in high-quality spaces. 41% of respondents were unsure and noted the importance of balancing development with preserving urban spaces and parks. There were concerns about 7-story buildings and a preference for smaller mixed-use buildings with ample parking and transportation options. 11% of respondents were not supportive and expressed concerns about potential displacement and housing affordability, increased density and traffic, and the specific state rules not allowing much room for local considerations. So downtown was voted most suitable for a CFA designation and had the most votes to become a primary CFA, with Glenwood Riverfront coming in second in both of these categories. There were some votes for Mohawk and the Gateway Riverbend area to be considered for a secondary CFA designation. I'm now going to highlight some of the information on demographics and potential displacement risk based on analysis that was done in 2023. Potential development or redevelopment in CFAs may increase property values over time, which could result in higher property taxes and housing costs within an area. As part of identifying and selecting one or more CFAs, Springfield is required to identify populations that may be more at risk of displacement and identify strategies to help avoid, lessen, or alleviate this potential risk. We're also required to focus on engagement efforts that strive to include the voices of underserved community members. Nearly half of Springfield's households are low income, which is a higher rate than in Oregon overall. As Springfield considers potential CFAs, it will be important to understand that a portion of our current residents already struggle to keep up with the cost of housing. Based on the potential displacement risk analysis, there are some vulnerable and active gentrification areas and a very small area of late gentrification in the downtown CFA. The Mohawk CFA also has some vulnerable areas, and I'll explain more about what those mean in a moment. While the Glenwood Riverfront and Gateway Riverbend areas were identified as having no potential risk, the demographics show that the Glenwood Riverfront has a higher proportion of low-income households, persons 65 years or older, and currently has more affordable rents and home values. The Gateway Riverbend area has a higher proportion of persons with limited English proficiency, persons with disabilities, and has seen increases in rents and home values over time. These factors are really important to consider when engaging with our community members and next steps, and when identifying potential displacement mitigation strategies as part of any of the CFAs. So as noted on the previous slide, Mohawk has some vulnerable areas and downtown has some vulnerable active gentrification, and the really small area of late gentrification in downtown only overlaps with a portion of Island Park. This table summarizes a few of the area types. Some of the area types did not appear in any of the potential CFAs, and most of Springfield was identified as having no risk. The first three types in this table are identified as having more low-income households compared to the city as a whole. Vulnerable areas also include more vulnerable people, such as those with disabilities or those who are 65 years and older. These areas also have older or multi-unit housing stock, but neither housing market activity nor demographic change is significant enough to indicate potential displacement risk. Similarly, the active gentrification areas are identified as low income with a high share of vulnerable people and older or multi-unit housing, but these areas have active housing markets and do show signs of gentrification as indicated by certain changes like increases in median household income. Late gentrification areas don't have many low-income households or much older or multi-unit housing, but they do have active housing markets with much more significant demographic changes. Later this year, the city will ask our community about what displacement strategies or mitigation strategies to consider as part of selecting one or more CFAs. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Alex, and Alex, feel free to just let me know when to, I'll try to monitor when to move forward on the slides.
Thanks, Chelsea. And good evening, commissioners. My name is Alex Steinberger. I'm a principal with Cascadia Partners. We're a land use planning and economics firm, and we were matched up with Springfield to help you get through the compliance with these climate-friendly area rules. So what I will be talking about today is some market analysis we did for these climate-friendly areas to get a better sense of what sort of potential they have for delivering all of this housing. And what we're seeing here on this slide is a table that shows the number of housing units of capacity that is forecasted to exist within each of these climate-friendly areas based on a methodology that is mandated by DLCD. And this is, so based on this, and Chelsea mentioned this earlier, what's required is that the climate-friendly areas that are designated, that they have capacity for just shy of 10,000 dwelling units within the next 20 years. And what we see in this table is that you actually have many times that amount of capacity if each of these climate-friendly areas were designated as primary CFAs. And slightly less, but still ample if many of them were designated as secondary CFAs. And to be clear, this is the benchmark that you are required to meet per state rules. However, if we go to the next slide, what we wanted to examine here is if we want these climate-friendly areas to actually have a chance of delivering at least a portion of that housing, we wanted to understand what the underlying market conditions are in each of them to help inform your decision of which to designate as primary, secondary, or non-CFAs. And so what we looked at are three things. We wanted to understand infrastructure availability, so whether there is ample or needed infrastructure that would need to be included in these areas or built out in these areas to support new development. Landowner willingness, so whether the development plans of major landowners in some of these climate-friendly areas is in line with what climate-friendly area development is supposed to look like. And finally, market economics. If construction costs and available rents and sales prices aren't high enough to justify development, then it's unlikely that a climate-friendly area will deliver the housing that it's meant to deliver, even if zoning is changed to allow taller buildings and more dense development. Next slide. And so I'm going to go through each of these three categories and give you a sense of what we found. And then we're going to talk about some modeling results that came of all of that research. So first, we're going to look at infrastructure status. And so we had a meeting with folks from various city departments and utilities to get a sense of what the infrastructure availability was in each of these climate-friendly areas, looking at electric utilities, water, wastewater, and stormwater. And the high level takeaway is that no individual climate friendly area has all of the infrastructure in place to support the amount of development that the amount of capacity that the state's methodology shows. It's a bit of a mixed bag. Downtown and Mohawk seem to be best positioned to deliver or to support increases in intensity and housing development. Glenwood and Gateway are a little bit further behind, but other challenges with their context also exist. By that I mean downtown and Mohawk, any additions to existing infrastructure would need to happen in an existing built urban context, which is more expensive to do than building out infrastructure in a greenfield context like you find in Glenwood and Gateway. So lots of considerations there, and we can dig more into those specifics if folks would like to do that. Next slide. So the next bucket of things that we looked at was landowner willingness. And so first we spoke with the development team that's working on the Glenwood master plan area, which, to be clear, is only a 30-acre piece of the larger Glenwood Riverfront proposed climate friendly area. And we wanted to get a sense of whether the development that is intended by climate friendly areas was consistent with the master planning effort that they're currently undertaking. And what we found is that while they do have a vision for relatively dense development, multifamily housing, some mixed use, that their findings consistent with ours was that buildings above 4 or 5 stories really aren't feasible in the current market. And so what they have envisioned is predominantly 4 and 5 story buildings with surface parking. That's of course very subject to change. They're still in the early stages of their master planning effort. And again, this is really only for this very small area of the larger proposed CFA. Potential outside of this area is pretty unknown. There is pretty fractured property ownership, lots of different owners, some of whom have existing, very successful operating businesses. There's some housing and individual property owners as well. And so it's unclear exactly what all of their plans are, and we didn't speak with them. But based on the conversations we did have, what we're hearing is that there is potential for more development here, but probably not at the intensity that the state's capacity methodology is assuming. Next slide. We also spoke with the person who's the primary overseer of real estate operations for Peace Health, because the Gateway Riverbend CFA is primarily consists of land owned by Peace Health. And what we found from that conversation was that because of the recent closure of the University District campus for Peace Health in Eugene, this is really the area in the region where Peace Health is focusing most of their efforts. And so that means that space for hospital expansion is at a premium in this CFA. So much of the land that appears vacant today is really earmarked for further expansion of hospital uses or medical office. Really just this 40-acre portion of land that you see in the hatched boundary here on this map that has any potential for residential development over the next couple of decades. It's a great site. It's adjacent to the Mackenzie River. It has some flooding, some floodway impacts on it, but generally has the potential to have the level of amenities that are consistent with what CFAs are supposed to be. But it's a much smaller area than I think was originally envisioned when this proposed CFA was put forth as an option. Next slide. So finally, our last bucket here is market economics. And we wanted to first get a sense of whether the tall buildings that are sort of the tall end of what climate friendly areas are supposed to consist of and what the state's methodology for capacity is based on, whether those things were realistic to assume in these climate friendly areas. And what we found is that generally right now they are not. They have higher construction costs than traditional wood frame buildings, because when you get to 7 stories, you can build no more than 5 floors of wood frame construction. And so you need to put those wood frame floors over concrete and steel, which is expensive to build. Also, mixed use buildings are challenging. Retail is not doing particularly great anywhere right now. And so including that in a project makes it more complicated and expensive, and doesn't deliver the revenue that a building needs to be successful. As we're probably all aware, there's also really high interest rates right now. So getting projects like this financed is a challenge. And rental rates are not currently high enough in most of Springfield to justify all of these other costs. So we think that that is one reason why the state's methodology probably overestimates development capacity pretty substantially, because it's assuming that everything that gets built looks like this. Next slide. Wanted to provide a little more context on this construction type thing because it's pretty important. What's important to understand is that construction costs don't increase linearly as you increase height and density. There are these big jumps in construction costs as you move from one construction type to another. And so as you go from wood frame to wood frame that's fire rated to wood frame over podium, which is what you need to get to 85 feet, to steel and concrete, which is what you need for high-rise construction, you get these big jumps in construction cost. And so right now, we think Springfield's market in general really only supports this fire-rated wood frame construction. Go any further beyond that, and the construction costs really get too high to be justified given the rents and sales prices that are available right now. But we should also mention that this is what things are like right now, and these CFAs are intended to provide 20 years of housing capacity. And so 5, 10, 15 years from now, all of these dynamics could be really different. But where we stand right now, this is what we're seeing. Next slide. So finally, given all of these things that we've looked at, the market economic trends, the landowner willingness, the infrastructure availability, we wanted to actually create an alternative capacity calculation to the state's methodology to get a more conservative estimate of what things are looking like. And so to do that, we started by looking at what existing zoning would deliver. Think of it as the do nothing case. We're not going to designate any CFAs, and all of the existing zoning stays in place. And so what we did is we created real estate pro forma that represent 4 different housing types that are possible to build within all of the zones that exist within the climate-friendly area boundaries. These are not all necessarily the maximum that you could build given existing zoning, but they are the maximum that the market is delivering right now, given the zoning that's available. Next slide. And then we did the same thing for an alternative case where we designate climate-friendly areas. So we created additional real estate pro forma that represent the kind of low end of what a secondary CFA would allow at 22 units per acre. That's the attached housing you see there in the upper left, all the way up to a 7-story, 5/2 wood frame over podium building that probably won't pencil, but we wanted to make sure that we were testing it to see if it would. Next slide. And the difference between the state's capacity calculation and this method is pretty substantial. The state's method assumes that every single parcel within each climate-friendly area redevelops to that 85-foot height. And so you're getting a completely different place when you're looking at it through that lens. Our market constraint calculation takes into account land costs, construction costs, available rents and sales prices, and only identifies those parcels that have the potential to redevelop, and then assumes that redevelopment happens on those parcels at a much lower density than what the state assumes. But as a reminder, we're trying to reach this 10,000 unit target, but we only need to do that with the state's methodology. But we are interested in what the market can actually deliver. Next slide. And so the way that we do this with the market constrained capacity is we use a metric called residual land value, or RLV for short. And what RLV is basically the maximum land price that a developer can pay given available sales prices or rents and all of the other factors that go into their building, like the cost of construction, the soft costs like taxes and SDCs, things like that, and then their profit assumption. So once you account for all those things, what is the maximum that they can pay for land? Next slide. And so if we know that a building can afford a maximum of, let's say, $20 per square foot for land, we can identify parcels within climate-friendly areas that are as expensive or less than $20 per square foot. And then we know that those have redevelopment potential and are counted towards the capacity estimates. Next slide. So next, I'm going to show you a series of slides, and these are pretty dense. And so I want to make sure that everybody understands what we're showing. So this first slide here is more of a tutorial, and then we'll get into the actual findings in a minute. So what you're going to see is a chart here that shows each climate-friendly area: downtown, Glenwood, Mohawk, Riverbend. And in the different colored bars, those represent the different building prototypes, the pro forma that we created. And so we're showing each of those building types in each climate-friendly area. And when the bar for an individual building type is above the 0 line, that indicates the maximum price that that building is able to pay and still be financially feasible within a given climate-friendly area. If that bar is below the 0 line, if it's negative, that means that even if the land were free, the building would not be financially feasible. And in fact, it would need a subsidy. Finally, this dashed line that you're seeing that kind of looks like a little city skyline, that tells us the 5th percentile, or in other words, the cheapest land that exists within each climate-friendly area. And when a bar for a given building type is above that line, it tells us that there is land in that climate-friendly area that that building can afford to be built on. You can still have a positive residual land value, as you see here in Mohawk, but be below that dashed line, and that tells us that land is more expensive than we are able to afford. So now we're going to go through these slides. So if we can go through to the next one, we're going to kind of go through our takeaways. So this is for existing zoning. If we keep existing zoning in place, what is the potential for these 4 housing types? So you can see in Mohawk, the current land prices, as I mentioned, are too high to make development feasible there. This is a challenge with Mohawk, kind of across the board. Land prices, for whatever reason, are much higher there than in other climate-friendly areas. So even though we see some positive residual land value from some of our buildings, it's not high enough for us to exceed that 5th percentile land price in Mohawk. Next slide. In Glenwood, we see that there is actually some pretty good potential for the 2 to 3 story garden apartment style construction. And even it's very much on the margin with that darker brown color. That's the 4-story apartment building that we modeled as well. And that's pretty consistent with what we were hearing from the development team in Glenwood. And also we think that as the master plan area builds out, that market's going to get stronger, and there's going to be more potential for denser multifamily housing there. Next slide. In Riverbend, we see that there's a much stronger market for ownership housing than there is for rental housing. So our garden apartments and our 4-story apartments, they don't really work very well in Riverbend, but the small lot single family and the attached housing or kind of lower density middle housing does pretty well. It's kind of right on the edge in Riverbend. Next slide. And then in downtown, garden apartments do pretty well, but other types of development don't quite do as well in downtown. So there's some potential there, but not quite as strong as in Glenwood. Next slide. So now moving on to our climate-friendly area case, where we're designating climate-friendly areas and seeing if any of those building types would pencil. And what we're seeing here is that there's actually some strong potential, but it's a mixed bag. First off, those 5- and 7-story buildings, as we thought, aren't feasible in any of the climate friendly areas today. So we don't think that there's much potential for those, even in Glenwood, where the market tends to be the strongest. And that's shown here by the negative values for those two building types. Next slide. In Mohawk and Riverbend, we think the most feasible outcome is kind of a higher density middle housing that's somewhere around 25 to 35 dwelling units per acre. So it could be a fourplex on a 4,000 square foot lot, for instance. It could be higher than that as well. But that sort of 2 to 3 story, but fairly compact development is what we see as being most feasible there. Next slide. And then in downtown and Glenwood, with CFA designations in place and the required zone changes there, also with the assumed improvements in the built environment, we think that these 3-story and 4-story apartments would be feasible there, and would probably do pretty well, especially in Glenwood, where we think the market's going to pick up as the master plan area gets built out and some of those infrastructure improvements happen to support that. Next slide. So wrapping up here, and then I'll pass it back to Chelsea. What we found was, unsurprisingly, the market constrained calculations, when referenced beside the state mandated calculations, they're much lower. Given existing code, no changes, no CFA designation, we think there's only about 3,300 capacity for about 3,300 units in all of the climate friendly areas, given current market conditions. If each of the 4 proposed CFAs were designated as primary CFAs, we'd get close to the 10,000 unit goal. It'd be about 9,000 units, which is pretty encouraging. And if all of them were designated as secondary CFAs, we'd be about halfway there with about 5,400 dwelling units. So definitely not as rosy a picture as we saw from the state mandated calculations, but hopefully helpful context for all of you as you're looking at these scenarios. So with that, I'll hand it off to Chelsea.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, so we're gonna go through a few scenario slides to try to summarize all of the information we just shared, but talk about it in some area specific terms. So the first scenario we're talking about here focuses just on the Glenwood master plan area as the only primary CFA, with downtown Mohawk and Gateway Riverbend being secondary. This option has the second strongest market potential for housing. For infrastructure needs, the Glenwood master plan area would need water and wastewater service expansion. The wastewater capacity estimates already account for higher density development in this area, since it currently allows for CFA style development. So the wastewater needs won't change if that area were to become a primary CFA. As mentioned earlier, Gateway Riverbend has some pretty strong infrastructure needs and constraints out of the potential locations we're looking at. If housing units are spread over all 4 of the areas, as shown in this scenario, existing electric substations have the physical space for additional transformers and feeders to serve the 30% housing capacity. There's no displacement risk in the Glenwood master plan area based on the analysis. This area is currently well aligned with the primary CFA regulations, but some changes would be needed in the other CFAs to comply with the secondary CFA regulations. This would include things like establishing maximum block lengths and allowing housing in more areas. Scenario B is pretty similar to the first one, except that it includes the entire Glenwood Riverfront CFA, which results in this option having the strongest market potential for housing. There are similar infrastructure needs as noted with the previous scenario, but including the larger Glenwood area increases those needs. Similarly, there's no potential displacement risk in the Glenwood Riverfront CFA. However, there are existing manufactured home parks and a concentration of people 65 years and older, which should be considered. The Glenwood Riverfront already mostly complies with the primary CFA regulations, but some changes would likely be needed to make the office mixed-use area more permissive of housing. The Glenwood Riverfront ranked second in our community survey for a primary CFA. As with the previous scenario, some changes would be needed in the other areas to comply with secondary CFA regulations. For both scenario A and B, the project team could explore the potential for replacing our existing nodal development areas with CFAs. Alternatively, how to address nodal development areas could be explored as part of upcoming work on code amendments for Springfield's mixed-use districts. Scenario C only focuses on downtown as a primary CFA. Downtown ranked the highest based on our CFA study criteria that was done last year and had the most votes to become a primary CFA in our community survey this year. It's the only area that could meet the housing capacity requirement on its own. For infrastructure needs in downtown, a water pump would be required to serve buildings taller than 3 stories. There would also be a need for a study of the wastewater basin on the east end of downtown. As mentioned earlier on the infrastructure slide, or as kind of shown, was concentrating all of the housing capacity in one area would require building an additional electric substation and transmission line. So it increases the electric needs by focusing on just the one area instead of all 4. Downtown has the most displacement risk out of all of the areas, so we will need to consider that when identifying mitigation strategies. This is true for all the scenarios we're presenting tonight, but particularly for this one, which would allow a higher increase in density, which could potentially create more development pressure in downtown. The existing zoning has some compliance with primary CFA regulations, but some zones such as R2 and mixed-use residential would require increases to the allowed maximum height and required minimum density. Other changes would be to establish maximum block lengths and allow housing in our community commercial zone. There is some concern about the higher minimum density requirement being potentially limiting to new housing that cannot achieve 25 dwelling units per acre. Scenario D is our last one we'll present, and this one focuses again on the Glenwood Riverfront as a primary CFA and only a smaller area of downtown as a secondary CFA. These areas have higher existing compliance with the CFA regulations and would require the fewest changes to existing plans and code as compared to the other scenarios. Downtown ranked highest in the community survey, with Glenwood Riverfront ranking second. If this scenario is preferred, we'll need to propose a downtown CFA boundary that meets the state's housing capacity requirement as part of next steps. This area would be larger than the existing downtown nodal area that's shown on this map as an example, but it could be smaller than the current downtown CFA boundary shown on the other maps. The infrastructure needs are similar to the other scenarios, with various improvements needed in Glenwood and downtown, but this scenario does not include Mohawk or Gateway Riverbend. And as a reminder, there's no displacement risk that was identified in the Glenwood Riverfront. However, even a smaller downtown CFA would still include areas with potential displacement risk that would need to be addressed with mitigation strategies. So similar to the table that we were showing with Alex earlier, this summarizes the housing capacity per the state's methodology and compares that to the market potential for new housing units for each of the scenarios we're presenting tonight. Most of these do comply with the state requirements except for scenario D. So if that option is preferred, we'll need to identify a downtown boundary that can meet that housing capacity requirement. Based on the current market conditions, scenario B has the strongest market potential for housing. To recap, most of the scenarios meet the requirements, but some have stronger capacity or potential for housing than others. Buildings over 4 to 5 stories are unlikely to be financially feasible until market conditions improve. And as Alex mentioned earlier, tomorrow's market might not look like today's. Also, public investments in these areas could improve the market conditions over time, and lending and labor environments could change. So my last slide before I'll open it up for questions and discussion, based on guidance from you all and council on Monday, the project team will work on next steps for outreach and identifying draft plan and code concepts as well as displacement mitigation strategies. There will be more opportunities for community input this fall. In early 2025, appointed and elected officials will be asked to select one or more CFAs out of any remaining potential locations. In determining which areas will be designated, the project team will identify the specific changes required to land use and zoning rules and to Springfield's comprehensive plan. Depending on the area, we may also need to identify changes to our neighborhood refinement plans. Ultimately, City Council will formally designate one or more CFAs and adopt the corresponding plan and code amendments. If the area includes property outside the city limits, such as the Glenwood Riverfront, the Lane County Board of Commissioners will also be part of the adoption process. At this point, I'd like to open it up for questions and discussion, and just a reminder that we're seeking your guidance on the potential scenarios to inform our next steps. And I'll stop sharing, but can go back if I need to for any of the slides if it's helpful.
I think since we're, go ahead, Commissioner Thompson.
Thank you for the amazing presentation. Can you all hear me okay? My videos. Okay, thank you. Great presentation. I said a few questions. One was being, I think one of the things we focused on was the fact that the different primary CFAs have different, well, some will be compatible and some will meet the requirements per state guidance and some weren't. And you mentioned on one of the slides that an exception may be required for some blocks that don't meet the minimum size. What is the exception process and what would the consequences be if we don't meet those requirements?
That's a great question. Right now, the CFEC rules allow for some exceptions to maximum block length requirements, I think in response to site and development constraints. So that's something we would need to explore further, what that exactly would look like and how we would be able to address that. And that's specific, I guess, to all of them, but specifically that was talked about with the Glenwood master plan area, since that's already currently an issue with the existing refinement plan and the block lengths that are in place now.
I had two more quick questions actually. So if the goal is, I assume the goal is as much as possible to maximize units per acre, and there are some great development examples up there. How will the city prioritize different developments if the goal is units per acre? So for example, if somebody comes in with a duplex or a quadplex, and then somebody else comes in with an apartment complex, but they're both allowable on that lot, who's going to win basically that proposal?
I think kind of how it plays out now is whoever proposes it first and builds it first.
My last question was regarding system development charges. Will SDCs be different based on the location of the primary CFA? So basically, will the Glenwood have different SDCs than the downtown, or is that purely calculated on a development by development basis?
It will still be calculated by development basis, so we wouldn't be changing SDCs with CFAs. And I see Sandy has her hand up, and so I don't know if that was in response to any of the questions that you just mentioned.
Thank you,
Andy?
Chelsea. I just want to make sure it's clear that there are minimum density standards in the CFAs. And so like duplex development probably is not going to meet the minimum density, particularly in the primary CFA, which has a 25 dwelling unit minimum per acre. So I just wanted to make sure that that was understood in terms of how we're comparing developments. Also, I think what is our goal is in question. I mean, clearly we need to comply with the rules, but are we, what we're also trying to do as a goal, I think, is part of what will inform your discussion of what is your preference. Are we trying to maximize dwelling units? Are we trying to have the most minimal change to our community? Are we trying to provide the greatest opportunity for mixed-use development. I think there's a variety of goals, and I think that's going to inform your your thoughts on how we should proceed with the different scenarios.
You both appreciate it.
Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. So, Josie, I want to first say that I felt like that was a great presentation. So thank you. I guess the one piece of feedback that I would kind of put out there is, and maybe what was unclear is, when you look at the downtown, option, there's this, there's the potential we can meet our numbers, so we can hit our requirements by doing that. Now the cost associated with that, what I'm not as clear on is where the sources of that funding may come from. I mean, obviously there's taxes, obviously there's some other things that go into that, but I'm wondering, as the state's mandated these things, are there state and federal monies that could come in to support some of those needs? Because it seems to me that the scenario that looks at downtown and or the scenario that looks at Glenwood, being that there's going to be overall development in Glenwood, makes a lot of sense. But I'm just curious. That would be the thing that I would wonder if I was going to pick between. The ones that stand out to me are, let's look at downtown and focus on that, or a downtown and Glenwood as secondary, because those look like they have the most potential. But again, those have some price tags that go with them, and understanding exactly how that would get funded would probably be an important part of that. And that's maybe not something you can answer tonight, and I know that we're not voting on this, so you don't necessarily have to go into the specifics, but that might be something that would be helpful if I were voting on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And yeah, don't know that we have a clear answer, but definitely some of them come with much bigger public investments that would be required to actually support that level of development. And that's definitely one of the big considerations in any of the scenarios.
Commissioner Salazar.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, just want to start off with echoing my fellow commissioners and just say great presentation, Chelsea and Alex. I think especially it's really, first of all, really great to see how much public participation we got. I think anytime we get over 1,000 views on a web page, that's cause for celebration, especially for something as dense as this. But I think the team has been really great about making this seem practical and applicable to the general public. I'd love to see, especially, it's just hard. I love to see the specific examples of this is what this type of development looks like. This is what a 7-story building looks like. This is what a 4-story building looks like, and especially using as many examples locally as we can. Just because, like, to the general public, an 86-story allowable, or an 86-foot allowable height might as well be the moon, and 7 stories seems like 15 stories. It seems like Manhattan. So I think realizing kind of what the actual developments would look like and what the market can support right now is super helpful, because I think folks see 86-foot allowable height and they think like, oh, this is going to completely change the composition of our city in really drastic ways, and that's really frightening. But I think you see what can the market support, and really thank you for that market analysis and that modeling of what can the market support, because I think that really shows us that this isn't as drastic of a change as maybe the most extreme scenario would be. It's more like, oh, the this is kind of what our community looks like, and it's just allowing it to fill out more in places where that's currently not allowed. So really, thank you for making that really concrete. I think to me it seems, and I know that we're not making a vote and you're just seeking guidance, so we don't need to make declare potential conflicts of interest, but I do feel compelled to mention that my employer is Homes for Good, and they were mentioned in one of the slides in terms of the landowners in the Glenwood Riverfront area. So I just want to mention that just as public accountability and transparency. But I think really, to me, the goals of the climate friendly and equitable communities rules are really about allowing more housing closer to more jobs, and to the extent possible, trying to drive development that both drives job growth and housing growth, and both of those can happen in the same area, so that people don't have to commute as far, and you can walk to go get your groceries instead of having to get in the car or get on the bus. To me, and I think it's really helpful to think about just the current market conditions that were considered in this in that analysis and in your study. Just, I think it's important to be realistic that there's just not a lot of, besides construction jobs, there's just not a lot of ability for this these climate friendly areas, especially in these areas, to generate a lot of ongoing jobs. Just like you said, the market's not supporting a lot of retail, and especially housing over retail. So I think, to me, it seems like a place of focus is just, where do we drive housing so that people can be closer to where the jobs currently are in our community? I think downtown Glenwood are already ideal for that. Gateway Riverbend is also a really good area for that, just because there's a major prime employer right there who's committed to staying in our community and actually having more development in that area. I'd love to hear that. So how do we allow more housing closer to where the jobs are if we can't generate those job opportunities specifically through this process? So I really like scenario A. It seems to grant the most flexibility in that growth, or in that area, as well as scenario B.
That's super helpful. And I just want to interject too. We presented a few scenarios, but those are not the only options. We just wanted to hone in on like a few that make the most sense maybe to us right now, but there's different ways we can go about this. We don't have to select one of the scenarios. We can still explore all 4 of the areas and just continue them with outreach. I think we're just hoping to understand if there are any of the areas that at this point are like a no way, doesn't make sense, we want to just drop it off the table now, or do we want to keep looking at all of these as we do the next steps with outreach and more work with the draft plan and code concepts?
I don't see any other commissioner questions, so I've got a few. So I was wondering, as I was going through the tables, which I think you all laid out really nicely for the value per square foot in attachment 2 and the market I guess the market analysis of that as it compares to the way the state has laid things out. Such a nice job. I was just wondering, does the modeling include any of the subsidies that Springfield currently has for more dense buildings?
We did not assume any, I'm not sure which subsidies in particular you're referring to, but we did not include any in our assumptions. We did calibrate our modeling to look at construction costs in your area. We looked at your system development charges to make sure that that was fairly reasonable. Property taxes, all of that stuff reflects what's going on locally. but we didn't assume any sort of subsidy or incentive.
I think we've got one for multi-unit housing. Somebody came to a meeting of this commission a couple of meetings ago and was arguing for a reduction in the height requirement of that subsidy from 4, I think, to 3 stories. So there are either some existing subsidies or some almost existing subsidies that would be interesting to see in those. Just a thought as you continue your work. And then I'm wondering what you all think about this. The value, especially of those taller buildings, it seems like the valuation that you all did was based on current value, which makes total sense. But I think, as you know, wherever we set these climate friendly areas as they densify, I'm wondering if you think that those land values will increase over time as the areas have more housing density and more services. And if, you know, we may say it doesn't pencil to create a 5 or a 7-story building now, but it will pencil like in 5 years if, you know, 5% of the properties have been rebuilt into something more dense.
It's certainly a possibility. I mean, there's a few things at play there. One is that real estate typically operates in a cycle, right? You see construction costs go up and down. What people have, this is really in the weeds, but economists have looked back and generally say that it's about 8 years between a boom and a bust in certain sectors of real estate. And so, you know, we are right now at a point in the cycle where construction costs are very high. But in 4 or 5 years, we may be at a different point in the cycle when they have come down, and it could make some areas feasible that aren't feasible today. At the same time, as the climate friendly areas designation isn't just about changing zoning to allow taller buildings. It's also about investing in infrastructure that makes these areas more walkable, better connected, more desirable potentially. And that could have an effect of generating potentially higher rents or sales prices in these areas. So that could also potentially make development feasible in the future that's not feasible today. And then the interest rate question is another one that we don't know what's going to happen. You know, we have a sense that they're coming down. We don't know how fast, but certainly, you know, in 10 years, it's anyone's guess what interest rates will be. So the best we can do is use the information we have available to us today and give you a sense of what that means for the positioning of these different climate friendly areas.
Cool, thank you. This is my last question. I tended to like scenario D, but it looked like it didn't pencil according to the state's rules. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, we just chose to at least explore if we did only the downtown nodal development area, could that meet our housing capacity requirements, just so we align with the current boundary we already have instead of all these mismatched lines on the map. But the area would need to be a little bit bigger than our nodal development area, but it could be smaller than the really big downtown CFA boundary. So that's another consideration of how we would draw that boundary, what's important to consider for downtown if that scenario is preferred.
It's kind of exactly what I was thinking. You know, if that scenario remains on the table, it would be nice for the boundary to be redrawn to a point where it was actually feasible if it's being considered. Cool. Those are all of my questions. Looks like Commissioner Thompson has one more or some more.
Just one more. I think we may be at time, so my apologies. I'll make this quick. I just noticed that trying to do some comparing, contrasting, which my kind of fellow commissioners have been doing very well as well. And the question I had is, I noticed on slide 36, it says the Glenwood Riverfront is the most compliant with primary CFA regulations and would require the least changes. And then on page 7 of the report you provided us, scenario C, it says that downtown ranked highest based on CFA study criteria and had the most votes to become a primary CFA in the community survey. And my apologies if this is detailed elsewhere, but I was curious why, or did your survey results detail why downtown was more favorable than other locations, and why did they prefer it?
I think there's a lot of community perception that downtown is, I mean, that's our center. That's where we want the taller buildings and the more mixed use development. So I think logically that makes sense. And that's what people kind of think of when we do think of our mixed use areas that are more walkable. Our downtown is that now. So downtown with the CFA study criteria, it ranked highest except for on the development regulation compliance. So Glenwood, the existing zoning in Glenwood is the most compliant, but downtown checked all the boxes on the other areas of it's more walkable, it has transit, more mixed use areas, parks, kind of has a lot of those existing conditions where Glenwood would need to play catch up in some of those areas.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. So, Chelsea and Alex, do you have any like last words on this stuff? Done such a good job. I want to make sure that you get everything in.
I think it's helpful, even just the discussion around kind of goals, even if it's not a specific scenario, is clearly the obvious choice at this point. Like hearing it's important to locate housing near jobs. I think that's a great thing to share with council when we present. We want to present the same information to them next week and share some of the feedback you all shared tonight, and see kind of what their thoughts are about next steps too.
Cool. Okay, well, I thank you so much for your presentation and all of my fellow commissioners for your really thoughtful questions. We are at 7:03, so we should adjourn so that we can start our regular meeting. I'm gonna adjourn the work session. And Sandy, is there any reason that we can't start the regular meeting right away?
Yeah, all the same commissioners are here, so no need for a roll call. And there's no adjustments to the agenda that I know of.
Great. So I hereby open the regular meeting of the Springfield Planning Commission. We don't need a roll call and we have no adjustments to the agenda. So I'm gonna call for the Pledge of Allegiance, and since we're, I guess, all online, you want me to lead that and the rest of you guys want to be muted? Is that how we do that?
Yes, please.
Okay, and I'm gonna stay seated so you can see my face instead of my belt buckle. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, let's move to the minutes. Are there any corrections to the minutes as published in the packet? Hearing none, the minutes are going to be approved as written. Do we have any business from the audience?
Not at this time.
Okay, moving on from business from the audience. We will now hear business from the Planning Commission. Are there any reports of council actions? Commissioner Salazar.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to mention that I have yesterday's council meeting. I haven't had a chance to watch yet, so I'll share in our next meeting.
Great, that sounds good. Anybody else? About any other business from the planning? Oh, Andrew, Commissioner Buck.
Yeah,
So I believe I have the previous one, not last week's, but the one before. And I think that it's available to watch online now. I just haven't had a chance to do it yet. And I will.
No problem. We'll catch it from you when you're ready. Any other business from the planning commission? Hearing none. Do we have any business from the Development and Public Works Department?
So I'm gonna try to look at the camera. It's a little bit awkward here, but so for summer, we will be having a meeting on July 2nd and then August 6th. So I'm trying really hard to just keep those meetings to once a month during the summer, but we do need to have you convene. We have some public hearings coming to you for land development applications. Plus, we're back to looking at annexation code amendments. And so as you may recall, you reviewed the community engagement strategy for that. For those of you who are catching up on council meetings, the council has had quite a number of annexations lately. And so it might be interesting for you to think about annexations as we get into some code amendments for that. So we tentatively have a work session on those for July 2nd, and then a public hearing is scheduled for August 6th on those amendments. And that is all I have to share.
Okay. And with that, I'm going to adjourn Planning Commission regular meeting. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thanks again to the staff for doing such a nice job explaining that CFA stuff to us. And we'll see you guys next time.